King John was dead. He died in 1216, a man defeated and despised, leaving behind a kingdom in chaos. His young son, Henry III, inherited the throne, but more importantly, he inherited a document, Magna Carta. This great charter was a promise. It declared that even the king was not above the law. It was a radical idea, a seed of liberty planted in the soil of a fractured England. The powerful barons had forced John to sign it, and now they made sure his son upheld it. The charter wasn't a perfect solution, and its principles would be tested, ignored, and fought over for centuries. But it marked a profound shift in power, the first step on a long road towards parliamentary rule and individual rights. This new reality took shape during Henry III's long and troubled reign. He was a pious man, a builder of great cathedrals, but a weak king. He surrounded himself with foreign favourites and spent lavishly, angering the English barons who felt their influence slipping away. One man rose to challenge him directly, Simon de Montfort. He was a charismatic and ruthless nobleman who believed fiercely in the principles of Magna Carta. De Montfort led a rebellion, captured the king, and in 1265 summoned a parliament. This assembly was revolutionary. For the first time, it included not just lords and bishops, but also ordinary knights and townspeople. It was a bold experiment in government, a glimpse of the future House of Commons. De Montfort's rule was short-lived. He was eventually defeated and killed at the Battle of Evesham by Henry's formidable son, Prince Edward. When Edward I took the throne, he proved to be everything his father was not. He was a fearsome warrior, a cunning lawmaker, and a king with immense ambition. He learned from de Montfort's rebellion, understanding the need to consult his powerful subjects. Edward I made Parliament a more regular institution, using it to raise taxes and pass laws that unified his kingdom. He was a king who built castles, codified laws, and forged a stronger English identity. His reign was defined by conquest and control, a relentless drive to expand his power. Edward's greatest ambition lay to the north. He was determined to bring Scotland under his heel, earning him the fearsome nickname Hammer of the Scots. He brutally sacked the town of Berwick and declared himself overlord of Scotland. But the Scots would not be so easily tamed. A knight named William Wallace rose from obscurity to lead a fierce resistance. He rallied his countrymen with a passion for freedom, inflicting a stunning defeat on the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Wallace became a symbol of Scottish defiance, a folk hero whose legend would echo through the ages. Though he was eventually captured and brutally executed in London, his spirit of resistance lived on, inspiring a nation to continue its fight for independence. The crown passed to Edward III in 1327, a king who embodied the chivalric ideals of his age. He was bold, charismatic, and obsessed with martial glory. His sights were set not on Scotland, but on a far greater prize, the throne of France. Citing a claim through his French mother, Edward III launched the conflict that would become known as the 100 Years' War. It was an audacious gamble, pitting the smaller kingdom of England against the mighty power of France. English armies, disciplined and deadly with the longbow, crossed the Channel. They won spectacular victories at Crécy and Poitiers, capturing the French king himself. For a time, it seemed as if Edward's impossible dream might just come true. England was a nation fired by military success, but as the war raged on, a new and more terrifying enemy arrived. It came not with swords and arrows, but on ships carried by fleas on the backs of black rats. In 1348, the Black Death reached England's shores. This was a pestilence of unimaginable horror. It swept through towns and villages, killing indiscriminately. The rich and the poor, the young and the old, all fell before it. Within 2 years, nearly half of England's population was dead. The country became a landscape of grief and despair. Fields lay fallow, villages were abandoned, and the very fabric of society seemed to be unraveling under the strain of such a colossal loss of life. The world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was irrevocably changed. With so many dead, labourers were suddenly in high demand. For the first time, peasants had bargaining power. They could demand higher wages and better conditions. The old feudal system, which had tied serfs to the land for generations, began to crumble. The government tried to stop this change. It passed laws to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, attempting to force the world back to the way it was, but it was too late. The survivors of the pestilence had a new sense of their own worth. The traditional bonds of society had been loosened, and a new, more volatile era had begun. This simmering discontent finally boiled over in the summer of 1381. Decades of war had led to crippling taxes, with the final straw being a new poll tax levied on every adult. A charismatic leader named Wat Tyler emerged in Kent, gathering a vast army of peasants, artisans and disgruntled villagers. They marched on London, their ranks swelling as they went. They were fueled by a sense of profound injustice and inspired by radical preachers who asked, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" The Peasants' Revolt was a fiery explosion of popular rage, a demand for an end to serfdom and a more equal society. The rebels stormed the capital, a shocking challenge to the authority of the young King Richard II. The young King Richard II met the rebels at Smithfield. He promised to meet their demands, a moment of high drama that ended with Wat Tyler's death and the brutal suppression of the revolt. The peasants' demands were rejected and the old order was violently restored. But the memory of the uprising lingered. It showed the ruling class that the common people could not be pushed too far. Richard II's reign continued to be turbulent, marked by his conflict with powerful nobles. He was eventually deposed by his own cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who seized the throne and became King Henry IV. This act of usurpation planted a dangerous seed. It showed that the crown could be taken by force, setting a precedent that would have bloody consequences later in the century. His son, Henry V, inherited a shaky throne but possessed an iron will. He was the ideal medieval king, a devout Christian, a brilliant military strategist, and a ruthless warrior. To unite his kingdom and legitimize his family's claim to the throne, Henry V renewed the war with France. In 1415, he led a small, exhausted, and sick army across northern France, pursued by a massive French force. The two armies finally met near a small village called Agincourt. The English were vastly outnumbered, trapped, and seemingly doomed. But Henry V was a master of tactics and a gifted orator. He rode among his men, inspiring them with a legendary speech about brotherhood and glory. The Battle of Agincourt was a staggering, almost unbelievable English victory. The English longbowmen, protected by a sea of mud and sharpened stakes, unleashed a storm of arrows upon the charging French knights. The heavily armoured French nobles were cut down in droves, unable to manoeuvre in the thick mire. It was a slaughter. The victory was so complete that it seemed like a sign of God's favour. Henry V became a national hero, his legend sealed forever. He went on to conquer large parts of northern France, and in the Treaty of Troyes was even named heir to the French throne. It was the absolute peak of English power in the Middle Ages. Henry's glorious reign was cut short by dysentery, and he died in 1422, leaving his infant son, Henry VI, as king of both England and France. This was a disaster. Henry VI grew up to be a gentle and pious man, but he was a catastrophically weak ruler, prone to bouts of mental illness. Under his feeble leadership, the English fortunes in France collapsed. Inspired by the visionary peasant girl Joan of Arc, the French rallied and drove the English out. By 1453, the 100 Years' War was over. All that remained of England's once great French Empire was the port of Calais. The defeated nobles returned home, bitter and armed, looking for someone to blame. Their anger would soon tear the kingdom apart. With the loss of France, the divisions within the English nobility exploded into open conflict. The court of the feeble Henry VI was dominated by his ambitious wife Margaret of Anjou and her allies. They were challenged by the powerful Richard, Duke of York, who had a strong claim to the throne himself. This rivalry between two branches of the royal family, the House of Lancaster, represented by the Red Rose, and the House of York by the White, ignited a brutal civil war. The Wars of the Roses were not a constant war, but a series of vicious and bloody battles fought over 3 decades. It was a dynastic struggle that pitted cousin against cousin, turning the English aristocracy into a nest of vipers. The fortunes of each side rose and fell dramatically. The Duke of York was killed in battle, but his charismatic son Edward took up the cause. A brilliant military commander, Edward crushed the Lancastrian forces and seized the throne, becoming King Edward IV. He brought a period of relative peace and stability, but the conflict was far from over. Betrayal and shifting allegiances were the currency of the age. Edward was even briefly driven from his own kingdom before returning to reclaim his crown, securing it with decisive victories that saw the death of the Lancastrian heir and the murder of Henry VI in the Tower of London. It seemed the House of York had finally triumphed for good. When Edward IV died unexpectedly in 1483, the kingdom was plunged back into chaos. His brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was named protector of the new king, the 12-year-old Edward V. But Richard was a man of ruthless ambition. He declared his nephews illegitimate, locked them in the Tower of London, where they mysteriously vanished, and had himself crowned King Richard III. This usurpation shocked the kingdom and created a host of new enemies. Richard was a capable ruler, but his reign was built on a foundation of suspicion and murder. Across the English Channel, a final claimant was waiting for his moment to strike. That claimant was Henry Tudor, a distant relation of the Lancastrian line who had lived in exile for years. With French support, he landed in Wales in August 1485, gathering an army of disaffected nobles and Welshmen. He marched to face Richard III at Bosworth Field. The battle was a desperate and brutal affair. In a pivotal moment, one of Richard's key allies betrayed him, switching sides in the middle of the fight. Richard, ever the warrior, charged directly at Henry Tudor in a final, frantic attempt to win the day. He was unhorsed, surrounded and hacked to death. The crown was picked from a hawthorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. He became King Henry VII, and by marrying a Yorkist princess, he united the warring houses. The Middle Ages were over. The Tudor dynasty had begun.